Anyone who ever says this is the first time in human history, you know they haven't read any history. They don't know what they're fucking talking about. There is no first time in human history. Our history as a species is cyclical and repetitive. It's very interesting, it's rich, it doesn't repeat itself exactly, but the themes have always been there. We've always had 5 tools for fixing the future. The first is regulation through government. The second is through innovation, through entrepreneurs like myself and some of you. The third is through consumers demanding better products and services. The fourth is through active citizenship and engagement, the pure manifestation of Moore's law. And the fifth is through education. So what I do in my book is come up with examples of how we are using these 5 tools, and they're kind of like the stack in a technology platform. The tools kind of intermingle. Sometimes they overlap. I'm not claiming that these tools are clean. But what I show in the book is that these tools are now being used. Regulation is really important. One of the reasons the American Silicon Valley revolution has failed is because it was so dramatically unregulated. The American political system, as most of you know, is paralyzed at best. It simply doesn't work. And Silicon Valley has been operating essentially in an unregulated environment. There are no controls in America. There's no antitrust regime. There are no data laws. There's no way to force these companies to be accountable. So who are the real innovators when it comes to regulation? The poor Europeans. They're patronized in America as lacking innovation, but actually they are the leaders, I discovered in the book. I come to Europe. I spend time with Vestager. The person, perhaps appropriately a woman, who is the only person to actually stand up to these new private superpowers. Tim Cook of Apple, who's not a bad guy, nonetheless, inherited a company that basically had figured out a way not to pay tax. So they created all these shell companies in Ireland, and they paid no tax. So Margaret Vestager, the EU commissioner, called Cook into her office in Brussels, where I also met with her, and she told him that he would have to pay some tax. He came out, he was shocked. He said, that was the worst meeting I've ever had. What resulted out of the meeting was a $12 billion fine to Apple, which they've started paying now. This is good. This is how regulation can work. I talked to Vestager. She's not some sort of Stalinist taking revenge on capitalism. She cares about the small people. She cares about reestablishing a level playing field. She wants taxes to be paid so that that money can go back into public works, like the High Line. She's taking on Google. She's launched 3 antitrust cases against Google, cases in which Google is using its dominance in search to crush startups in other areas. And it's not just Vestager. All over Europe, we have real innovation. The EU has launched this month the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a form of regulation which will give consumers power back over their own data. This is critically important. It may not work in its first version. It's complicated law. Anything that comes out of Brussels, of course, is anything but perfect. But it's a start. It's a beginning. It's a way of improving the world. And of course, Europe is also forcing these companies to become accountable. It's forcing them to take responsibility for the crap that's published on their platforms. So Facebook and Zuckerberg can stand back and say, well, it's not us publishing anti-Semitism or hatred of women or racism or absurd conspiracy theories that this didn't really happen or that didn't really happen. They get away with it, they monetize this content, but unlike newspapers, they're not accountable in America because they figured out a new law which wouldn't make them accountable. The Germans are making them accountable. Every time Facebook publishes something profoundly offensive or illegal, now they get fined $50 million. Now that may seem a lot to each of us, maybe not to Facebook, but those $50 million fines add up and become meaningful after a while. So regulation matters, and Europe is leading. Innovation also matters. We need to unleash a new wave of innovation. We need more entrepreneurs. We need to go back to 1999, when the Googles and the Facebooks really did reinvent the world, smashing that old Microsoft world. We're back at the beginning again. History is cyclical. We need to go back to that. We need entrepreneurs coming up with new products and services and platforms which don't exploit consumers. New products and platforms which really enrich the world and not just a tiny group of young white privileged men in Silicon Valley. Consumers need to play their role too. In my work, I go around the world and I see the way in which consumers are fighting back, demanding rights. We need to stand up. Some of you say, well, what can I do? I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm not a regulator. We're all consumers. We need to be more demanding and critical, as we've been in many other industries, from food to cars. I have an example of the car industry where the Americans invented cars which were death traps. That resulted in a crisis of the American car industry. Ultimately, the Silicon Valley model is flawed. We, of course, all need to act as citizens. Moore's Law is absolutely critical. Moore's Law is central if we're to reshape our world appropriately, and we all have a role to play in that. And finally, and I'm rushing through this because I don't have a lot of time, but finally, education is key. We need to rediscover the things which humans can flourish in a digital world where the old industrial education system doesn't work. So the final chapter in my book, I go to new or not so new educational establishments, places like Waldorf and Montessori schools, which are bringing out the creativity in us. Coming back to our previous speaker and the High Line, if we are to replicate the High Line, that public space, that enriching place where humans can be happy, where they're not watched all the time, where they're not exploited, where they're not bombarded with garbage advertising and lies, we need to educate them properly. We need to bring out their humanness. We're not educating them to be computers. They don't need to become human calculating machines. We need to bring out our empathy, our creativity, our true community instincts. That's what education needs to focus on in the digital age. It won't be done easily, but as I show in my book, we're beginning. It's a long road, but at least we've started. Thank you.